The crystal goblets shattered against marble floors as 13 bodies writhed in agony around the mahogany table. Steam still rose from the untouched roast as screams echoed through Willowbrook Plantation's dining hall. Tonight, we uncover a story of resistance that history tried to bury, one that reveals how far the human spirit will go when pushed beyond its breaking point. The year was 1857, and Willowbrook Plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of Georgia clay like a monument to human cruelty. The scent of magnolia blossoms couldn't mask the stench of suffering that hung over the quarters where 200 souls lived in bondage. Tonight, in the flickering candlelight of the great house, that suffering would find its voice. But before we dive deeper into this tale of revenge and resistance, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. If this story grips you the way it gripped me during my research, hit that like button and subscribe, because the darkness we're about to explore together gets much deeper. Master Cornelius Whitmore sat at the head of his dining table, carving knife glinting, as he prepared to slice into the evening centerpiece. Around him, his family and guests, the county judge, the neighboring plantation owners, the local preacher, waited with practiced patience. These monthly dinner parties were Whitmore's pride, a chance to display both his wealth and his control over every aspect of life at Willowbrook. In the kitchen below, separated by creaking floorboards and a lifetime of carefully maintained distance, Celia worked with movements that had become mechanical over her 32 years of bondage. Her hands, scarred from countless burns and cuts, arranged the final garnishes with the precision Whitmore demanded. But tonight, those same hands trembled, not with fear, but with purpose. The dining room above buzzed with conversation about cotton prices and political tensions. Judge Harrison's voice carried through the floor. The problem with these people is they don't understand their place in the natural order. Laughter followed, the kind that comes easy when you've never questioned your right to own another human being. Celia had heard variations of this conversation for decades. She'd served at hundreds of these dinners, invisible in her service, watching these men debate her humanity over wine and roasted meat. But 3 days ago, something had changed forever. Little Samuel, barely 8 years old, had been caught learning to read from scraps of newspaper. Whitmore's response was swift and brutal, a whipping that left the child unconscious and marked Celia's breaking point. Samuel was her nephew, the son of her sister, who'd been sold away 5 years prior. He was all the family she had left. The kitchen door swung open as Celia's assistant, an elderly man named Moses, returned from the garden. His eyes met hers with understanding they'd spoken in whispers earlier, their conversation a mixture of gullah phrases and careful English, discussing what had to be done. "Everything ready?" Moses asked, his voice barely audible over the clatter of dishes. Celia nodded toward the copper pot simmering on the stove. Inside, wild mushrooms from the deep woods bubbled in rich cream sauce mushrooms. She'd gathered herself from the rotting logs where death grew naturally, the same mushrooms the old root woman had warned her about when she was a child, the ones that looked innocent but carried agony in their flesh. The dining bell rang, its bronze voice cutting through the evening air like a summons to judgment. What drives a person to cross a line they can never uncross? What happens when the only choice left is between destruction and surrender? As Celia lifted the serving tray and walked toward the stairs, she carried more than just the evening's final course. She carried the weight of every injustice, every stolen child, every broken promise that had led to this moment of reckoning. Celia's bare feet whispered against polished oak as she climbed the servants' staircase, each step a countdown to chaos. The silver serving dish grew heavier in her hands, its contents gleaming like amber death under the gaslight. This moment represents more than one woman's revenge. It exposes the powder keg tensions that made the antebellum South a breeding ground for the very resistance it tried so desperately to crush. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9:30 as Celia pushed through the dining room's mahogany doors. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across oil paintings of Whitmore ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to watch as she moved between the chairs. The conversation paused. Momentarily, these men had been trained since birth to notice the help only when service faltered. "Ah, the mushroom course," Whitmore announced, dabbing his mustache with Irish linen. "Celia here has quite the talent for foraging. Tell them about those mushrooms, girl." Celia's voice remained steady, though her pulse hammered against her throat. "Found them in the old grove, master, where the dead trees make good soil." Every word was truth, just not the whole truth. She began with Judge Harrison, ladling the cream sauce over his slice of venison. His face flushed from wine and self-satisfaction. He barely glanced at her. Next came Dr. Pemberton, the man who'd examined Samuel after his beating and declared him fit for continued work. Then Reverend Mills, who preached every Sunday about the Christian duty of masters to care for their human property, while conveniently ignoring the screams that echoed from the whipping post. Each serving was precise, measured. Each man received exactly what he'd earned through years of willful blindness. Mrs. Whitmore tittered about the upcoming county social as Celia moved around the table. "I do hope the weather holds. Last year's rain simply ruined my silk slippers." She spoke as if the world beyond her comfort never existed, as if the quarters where families were torn apart stood on another planet entirely. But it was young Master Thomas who made Celia's hand pause. Whitmore's 18-year-old son had returned from university full of northern ideas about gradual emancipation. He'd even spoken kindly to some of the field hands. Yet when push came to shove, when Samuel needed protection 3 days ago, Thomas had stood silent while his father wielded the whip. Silence makes accomplices of us all. The cream sauce pooled around his portion, like fate accepting no exceptions. As Celia served the final guest, Colonel Barrington, who owned the neighboring plantation and regularly bragged about breaking runaways, she noticed Moses hovering near the kitchen door. His weathered face betrayed nothing, but she caught the slight nod he gave her. The other servants had been warned. None of them would taste tonight's meal. The conversation resumed its familiar rhythm of casual cruelty. Colonel Barrington regaled the table with a story about his latest acquisition, a 14-year-old girl purchased specifically for breeding. Dr. Pemberton chimed in with theories about cranial measurements and intellectual capacity. Judge Harrison discussed new legislation to restrict the movement of free blacks. They ate as they talked, forks scraping against china, the mushroom sauce disappearing bite by bite. Celia retreated to her position along the wall, hands clasped, eyes downcast in the posture that had kept her alive for 3 decades. But inside, she counted heartbeats. The first symptom would be subtle, a slight burning in the throat, easily mistaken for rich food or strong wine. The wild mushrooms she'd selected were particularly insidious, their toxins building slowly before striking like a coiled snake. She'd learned about them from her grandmother, who'd whispered warnings about the death that grew in pretty packages throughout the Georgia woods. Master Thomas was the first to notice something amiss. He touched his throat delicately, then reached for his water glass. The gesture was small enough that no one else paid attention, lost as they were in their discussion of cotton futures and slave prices. 10 minutes passed. 15. Then, Reverend Mills coughed a harsh, rattling sound that made Mrs. Whitmore glance his way with mild concern. "Are you quite well, Reverend?" "Just a tickle," he managed, though sweat had begun beading on his forehead despite the evening's cool air. "What would you do if you discovered the meal you'd just eaten carried more than seasoning? How long would it take for suspicion to bloom into certainty?" As the clock's minute hand crept toward 10 o'clock, Celia stood motionless against the wall, watching 13 people who'd built their fortunes on human suffering begin to realize that tonight the suffering had found its way to their table. Judge Harrison's fork clattered against his plate as his hands began to shake uncontrollably. The sound cut through the dining room like a gunshot, silencing every conversation. Tonight we witness how a system built on dehumanization creates the very monsters it claims to fear, and how those monsters aren't always who you'd expect. The mahogany walls seemed to close in as realization dawned on 13 faces simultaneously. Dr. Pemberton, his medical training kicking in despite his own growing distress, pushed back from the table and struggled to his feet. "Something's wrong," he gasped, his voice already hoarse. "The food," but his words dissolved into a fit of violent coughing that doubled him over. Blood specked his white collar. Celia remained motionless against the wall, her face a mask of practiced servitude even as chaos erupted around her. 32 years of survival had taught her to disappear in plain sight, to become furniture when the masters needed someone to blame. Now, that skill served a different purpose entirely. Mrs. Whitmore's scream pierced the air as her husband collapsed sideways in his chair, his body convulsing. The crystal wine glasses toppled like dominoes, spreading crimson stains across the white tablecloth. But it wasn't wine that painted the linen red. It was the blood that had begun flowing from 13 mouths as internal organs surrendered to the toxins coursing through their systems. Young Master Thomas, still conscious but writhing in agony, turned his eyes toward Celia. In that moment, she saw something she'd never witnessed before. Not anger, not surprise, but understanding. He knew. Somehow, he knew exactly what she'd done and why. "You," he whispered, the word barely audible over the sounds of his family's suffering. Celia met his gaze without flinching. Yes, it was the first time in 3 decades she'd spoken to a white person without the careful deference that kept slaves alive. The first time she'd claimed ownership of her actions, instead of hiding behind the veil of invisible servitude. Chaos breeds truth in its wake. Colonel Barrington tried to crawl toward the door, his legs no longer supporting his weight. The man who'd bragged about breeding children like livestock now mewled like a wounded animal, his dignity stripped away by the same merciless efficiency he'd shown his human property. Reverend Mills, the preacher who justified slavery from the pulpit every Sunday, gasped out what might have been prayers or curses. His God seemed remarkably absent from this particular miracle. But it was Judge Harrison who spoke the words that cut deepest. Between spasms that racked his frame, he managed to rasp, "Why?" Celia stepped forward from her position against the wall. For the first time in her adult life, she moved through the dining room, not as a servant, but as an equal, addressing her peers in suffering. "Samuel," she said simply. He was 8 years old. The judge's eyes widened with what might have been comprehension. 3 days ago, he'd been present when Whitmore administered the beating that left a child unconscious for learning to read. He'd watched from his comfortable chair on the veranda, sipping whiskey while a man destroyed a boy for the crime of curiosity. He'd said nothing, done nothing. They all had. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 10:15 as the sounds in the dining room gradually subsided. One by one, the convulsions slowed. The gasping stopped. The men who'd built their empire on human bondage found themselves on the wrong side of absolute power. Moses appeared in the doorway, his aged frame silhouetted against the kitchen's warm light. Behind him stood 3 other house servants, people who'd spent decades watching, waiting, enduring. Their faces showed no surprise, only the quiet satisfaction of seeing justice served on fine china. "It's done?" Moses asked. Celia nodded, then walked to the window overlooking the quarters where 200 souls waited in the darkness. Tomorrow, those people would wake to a world without Master Whitmore. But tonight, they'd sleep as they always had, uncertain, afraid, trapped between hope and despair. The poison had solved nothing and everything simultaneously. What happens when the oppressed discover they're not as powerless as they've been taught? How quickly does the natural order crumble when someone refuses to accept their assigned place in it? As Celia began clearing the dishes from the table, a gesture so automatic it transcended the horror surrounding her. She wondered if the other plantations would learn the right lesson from tonight's tragedy, or if they'd simply tighten their chains and sharpen their whips. Dawn broke gray and cold over Willowbrook Plantation, as smoke no longer rose from the great house chimneys. The silence that had settled over the estate felt different from the usual pre-dawn, quiet, heavier, more final. What we're witnessing is the moment when an entire social system confronted its own fragility, when the myth of absolute control shattered like fine china against hard truth. Sheriff William Causey arrived at 8:30 that morning, summoned by a field overseer who'd grown suspicious when no bells rang to start the day's work. The lawman's boots echoed against the marble foyer as he discovered what remained of 13 of the county's most powerful citizens, still seated around their mahogany table, like participants in some macabre dinner party frozen in time. The servants had vanished. Every last one of them, house staff, field hands, stable workers, 200 souls, had disappeared into the Georgia wilderness during the night, leaving behind empty quarters and unanswered questions. They'd taken nothing but the clothes on their backs and something far more valuable: their freedom. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the county coroner brought in from Savannah, spent 3 days examining the scene. His report, filed with the state authorities on October 15, 1857, noted symptoms consistent with aconitine poisoning derived from indigenous flora. The wild mushrooms found in the kitchen provided all the evidence needed to reconstruct the evening's final meal. But the investigation raised more questions than it answered. How had an enslaved woman acquired knowledge of such precise toxicology? Where had 200 people disappeared to without leaving tracks? And most troubling for the surrounding plantation owners, what did this mean for their own safety? The answer to that last question came swiftly and decisively. Within 6 months, 4 more plantation houses experienced similar accidents. A well in South Carolina became mysteriously tainted. A grain storage in Alabama developed a fatal mold overnight. Fire consumed Virginia Manor House with suspicious efficiency, trapping its occupants inside. Fear spread like wildfire through parlors and plantation offices across the South. The comfortable assumption that enslaved people were docile and controlled crumbled as quickly as autumn leaves. Suddenly, every cook became a potential assassin, every house servant a possible spy, every smile a mask hiding deadly intentions. A system built on violence discovered itself vulnerable to that same violence. The Confederate authorities launched investigations, increased patrols, implemented stricter controls. They offered rewards for information about the Willowbrook survivors, but no one came forward. It was as if 200 human beings had simply evaporated into the morning mist. Years later, during the chaos of the Civil War, stories would surface about a settlement deep in the Okefenokee Swamp where former slaves had built a hidden community. Travelers spoke of meeting a middle-aged woman with knowing eyes who could identify every poisonous plant in the Georgia wilderness and taught others to do the same. But these were just stories, rumors, legends that grew in the telling. What remained undeniably true was that the Willowbrook incident marked a turning point. The comfortable fiction that enslaved people accepted their bondage willingly became impossible to maintain when 13 prominent citizens lay dead from their cook's final meal. How many other Celias waited in kitchens across the South, measuring ingredients and biding their time? How many other plantations harbored the seeds of their own destruction? As the investigation files were quietly sealed, and the story began its transformation into whispered legend, one truth echoed through every great house, from Georgia to Virginia: the hands that prepared your food might not be as loyal as you believed. The courthouse steps in Milledgeville echoed with urgent footsteps as Governor Joseph Brown convened an emergency session on November 3, 1857. The marble corridors buzzed with whispered conversations about plantation security and the Willowbrook problem. This moment reveals how quickly those in power can shift from confidence to paranoia, when their foundational assumptions about control are proven false. Representative James McCall from Whitmore's own district stood before the assembly, his voice carrying across the packed chamber. "Gentlemen, we face a crisis that threatens the very foundation of our agricultural economy. If enslaved populations believe they can strike at their masters with impunity, the entire system becomes untenable." The legislation that emerged from that emergency session became known as the Kitchen Acts, a series of laws requiring plantation owners to hire white overseers for all food preparation, limiting enslaved people's access to certain plants and herbs, and mandating regular inspections of slave quarters for suspicious materials. But paranoia makes poor policy. The new regulations created more problems than they solved. White cooks demanded wages that many plantation owners couldn't afford. The restrictions on plant gathering disrupted traditional medicine practices that had kept enslaved populations relatively healthy. Most significantly, the heavy-handed enforcement alienated enslaved people who had previously remained passive. Dr. Morrison's confidential report to the governor, dated December 1st, 1857, painted a troubling picture. The Willowbrook incident appears to have been a coordinated action involving extensive planning and knowledge sharing. The precision of the poisoning suggests formal training, not accidental discovery. The implications were staggering. Somewhere in the hidden networks that connected enslaved communities across state lines, knowledge was being preserved and transmitted. Skills that could preserve life or end it passed from one generation to the next through channels completely invisible to white authorities. Meanwhile, in Charleston, Richmond, and New Orleans, similar incidents began occurring with increasing frequency. A prominent judge's family in Louisiana suffered mysterious stomach ailments after a Sunday dinner. A Virginia plantation owner's prize hunting dogs died overnight after consuming scraps from the kitchen. A South Carolina banker's well developed an unusual taste that sent his entire household to bed with violent illness. None of these incidents could be directly linked to the Willowbrook case, but the pattern was unmistakable. The comfortable relationship between master and servant had been poisoned as thoroughly as that final meal in Whitmore's dining room. Insurance companies began refusing to cover plantation households. Banks grew reluctant to extend credit for agricultural ventures. Northern abolitionists seized on the incidents as proof that slavery was not the benevolent institution Southerners claimed it to be. The economic foundation was cracking. Young men who might have inherited plantations chose other professions. Families that had built their wealth on human bondage quietly began liquidating their holdings and moving to cities. The myth of the contented, loyal slave had died along with 13 diners in a Georgia mansion. But perhaps the most significant change occurred in the quarters themselves. Enslaved people who had endured their bondage with resignation began asking different questions. If Celia could strike at the heart of the system that oppressed her, what might others accomplish? If 200 people could vanish into the wilderness and survive, how many more might follow? The Underground Railroad, already operating throughout the South, found its ranks swelling with new conductors and passengers. Escape attempts increased dramatically. Work slowdowns and equipment failures plagued plantations across the region. What happens when the oppressed discover they're not as powerless as they've been taught to believe? How quickly does an unjust system collapse when its victims refuse to remain victims? As 1858 dawned, plantation owners throughout the South found themselves prisoners in their own great houses, afraid to trust the people who cooked their food, cleaned their rooms, and knew their most intimate secrets. Bloodhounds bayed through the Okefenokee Swamp as Captain Marcus Thorne led the largest manhunt in Georgia history. 3 months after Willowbrook, the authorities had finally organized a coordinated effort to track down the vanished enslaved population. This chase represents more than a search for fugitives. It reveals how a society built on human bondage reacts when that foundation begins to crumble beneath its feet. Thorne's expedition included 40 mounted men, professional slave catchers from as far as Tennessee, and a pack of dogs trained specifically for tracking runaways. The state had posted a reward of $5,000 for information leading to the capture of the Willowbrook fugitives, more money than most Georgian farmers saw in 5 years. But the swamp seemed to swallow their efforts whole. For weeks, the search parties found nothing but false trails and abandoned camps. Every promising lead dissolved into the murky water and dense vegetation that had protected runaway slaves for generations. The few tracks they discovered led to dead ends where the earth itself seemed to have erased all evidence of human passage. Local Creek and Seminole tribes, when questioned, claimed no knowledge of any large group of refugees. Their silence felt deliberate, loaded with the kind of non-cooperation that comes from understanding oppression intimately. Dr. Agnes Blackwood, a botanist from the University of Georgia, who joined the expedition to study swamp flora, made a disturbing discovery. On March 2, 1858, deep in the wetlands, she found cultivated patches of plants that shouldn't have existed together naturally. Medicinal herbs growing alongside highly toxic species in carefully tended gardens, hidden beneath the canopy. "Someone's been here," she reported to Captain Thorne. "Someone with extensive knowledge of both healing and poisoning has been systematically cultivating these specimens." The implications chilled the search party. The Willowbrook incident hadn't been an isolated act of desperation. It was evidence of a larger network, a hidden community that had been preparing for resistance far longer than anyone realized. Knowledge was being preserved in the wilderness. Meanwhile, reports continued filtering in from across the South. A Mississippi plantation's livestock died overnight after consuming feed that had been stored normally for months. A Kentucky manor house's entire family fell violently ill after a Christmas dinner prepared by servants who'd worked there for decades. Each incident followed a similar pattern: precision, planning, and the complete disappearance of those responsible. The manhunt's failure became a political liability. Governor Brown faced increasing pressure from plantation owners who demanded protection they couldn't provide. Northern newspapers began covering the story, painting the South as a region where masters lived in terror of their own enslaved populations. But it was a letter delivered to Captain Thorne's camp on March 15th that changed everything. Written in careful script on expensive paper, it contained just a few lines. "To those who hunt what cannot be caught, we are where you cannot follow, learning what you cannot teach, becoming what you never allowed. The swamp remembers everything. C." The single initial at the bottom could have stood for many names, but Thorne knew immediately who had written it. Somewhere in the vast wilderness, Celia was not just surviving, she was teaching others to do what she had done. The letter included a botanical sketch of wild mushrooms with detailed notes about their properties, preparation methods, and effects. It read like a textbook page, complete with scientific terminology that no enslaved person was supposed to possess. How had she acquired such knowledge? Who had taught her to write with such precision? And most terrifying of all, how many others now shared her expertise? The manhunt officially ended 2 weeks later, when 3 of Thorne's men fell seriously ill after eating fish caught from a supposedly safe creek. The symptoms matched those reported at Willowbrook exactly. Even in the wilderness, even while being hunted like animals, the fugitives maintained their ability to strike back at those who pursued them. The message was unmistakable. Some prey had become predators. What happens when the hunted become the hunters? How do you capture people who know the landscape better than you do and possess skills you can't even comprehend? As the search parties withdrew from the swamp, leaving behind their equipment and their confidence, plantation owners throughout the South realized that the greatest threat to their way of life might not come from northern abolitionists or political legislation, but from the kitchens and gardens of their own estates. Church bells rang across Atlanta on January 1st, 1863, as President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation took effect. The news reached even the deepest corners of the Georgia swamplands, carried by Union messengers, and whispered through networks that had operated in shadow for generations. This moment transforms our story from one of desperate resistance into something larger, on the dawn of legal freedom that made such desperate measures unnecessary. In the hidden settlement deep within the Okefenokee, Celia stood before a gathering of nearly 300 people. The community had grown far beyond the original Willowbrook fugitives, welcoming runaway slaves from across the South who'd heard rumors of a safe haven in the wetlands. What they'd built together defied every assumption about what enslaved people could accomplish when freed from oppression. The settlement included workshops, schools, gardens, and even a small infirmary, where Dr. Samuel Patterson, a free black physician who'd fled Virginia after helping too many runaways, treated injuries and illnesses with the same herbal knowledge that had once served darker purposes. "The war's changing everything," Patterson announced to the assembled crowd. "Union forces are moving through Georgia. Legal freedom is coming." Celia nodded, feeling a weight she'd carried for 6 years beginning to lift. The skills she'd used to strike back at her oppressors could finally serve their intended purpose, healing rather than harming. The botanical knowledge that had once delivered poison now produced medicines that kept their community healthy and strong. Moses, now in his 70s but still sharp-eyed and determined, raised his weathered hand. "What about justice for what they did to us? For Samuel and all the others?" "Justice is coming," Celia replied, "but not the kind we once had to deliver ourselves." She was right. As Union forces advanced through the South, they documented the conditions they found on plantations, gathering evidence of systematic brutality that would reshape how the world viewed American slavery. The Willowbrook incident, once dismissed as an isolated tragedy, became part of a larger pattern that prosecutors would use in war crimes tribunals. The community had kept detailed records, not just of their own experiences, but of the plantation owners who'd fled south as Union forces approached. Names, locations, documented abuses, evidence that would prove invaluable to military courts seeking to hold war criminals accountable. Hope bloomed in unexpected places. By 1865, as Confederate forces surrendered and Reconstruction began, many members of the swamp community chose to emerge from hiding. They returned to Georgia towns as free citizens, carrying with them skills and knowledge that would prove invaluable in building a new society. Celia became a teacher, establishing schools for formerly enslaved children throughout rural Georgia. The same intelligence that had once planned deadly resistance now focused on education and community building. She taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and yes, botany, but with an emphasis on healing herbs rather than harmful ones. The Willowbrook Plantation itself became a school for freed slaves. Its great house converted into classrooms where children learned the literacy that had once been forbidden. The dining room where 13 people died became a library, its shelves filled with books instead of bitter memories. What happens when desperation transforms into hope? How does a community built on resistance evolve into one focused on rebuilding? As the 19th century drew to a close, visitors to rural Georgia sometimes encountered an elderly woman with kind eyes who could identify every plant in the forest and tell you exactly how to use it for medicine. Children loved her stories about the old days, though she rarely spoke about the darkest chapters of her past. Sunlight filtered through classroom windows at the Willowbrook Freedom School as 80-year-old Celia traced botanical illustrations on a worn chalkboard. Her students, children, and adults, learning to read together, copied her drawings into notebooks made from brown paper and determination. This final chapter reveals how acts born from desperation can transform into foundations for hope, and how the darkest moments in history often plant seeds for brighter futures. The year was 1895, and the small school that had risen from the ashes of a plantation dining room had become a beacon throughout rural Georgia. Former slaves traveled hundreds of miles to learn reading, writing, and practical skills that would help them navigate freedom. But they also came to learn from the woman whose story had become legend, the cook who'd poisoned 13 masters and lived to teach their children a different way. Celia's lessons extended far beyond literacy. She taught sustainable farming techniques that didn't require expensive equipment. She showed students which plants could heal common ailments when doctors were too expensive or too distant. Most importantly, she demonstrated that knowledge itself was the most powerful form of resistance. Education, she told her students, is the poison that kills ignorance. But unlike what I once served, this kind of poison heals instead of harms. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The same hands that had once measured deadly mushrooms now measured chalk dust and hope in equal proportions. Young Marcus Williams, great-nephew of the boy whose beating had triggered the Willowbrook incident, raised his hand. "Miss Celia, my grandmother says you were there when the masters died. Says you made it happen." Celia paused, her aged fingers still holding the chalk. She'd spent decades avoiding direct answers to such questions, but these children deserved truth delivered with wisdom. "I was there," she said simply. "I made choices that seemed necessary at the time, but I hope none of you will ever face such terrible decisions. I hope the world we're building together means you'll have better options than I did." She turned back to the chalkboard, where her botanical sketches showed healing herbs rather than harmful ones. The same knowledge can preserve life or end it. The choice of how to use what you learn, that's what makes you human. As the afternoon session ended and students filed out into the Georgia sunshine, Celia remained at her desk. Grading papers written in careful script by hands that would have been cut off for holding pencils 40 years earlier. Progress moved slowly, imperfectly, but it moved. The transformation was incomplete, imperfect, but undeniable. Dr. Patterson, now the school's principal, stopped by her classroom as evening shadows lengthened. The county inspector was impressed, he reported. "Test scores are higher here than at most white schools in Atlanta." Celia nodded, unsurprised. Hungry minds learn fast when they're finally fed. Through the window, she watched children playing in the schoolyard where slave quarters had once stood. Their laughter carried across the same ground where generations had suffered in silence. The contrast wasn't lost on her, how the worst of human cruelty could give birth to the best of human resilience. What legacy do we leave when we transform our pain into purpose? How do we ensure that future generations learn from our struggles without having to repeat them? As Celia locked the school doors that evening, she carried with her the satisfaction of knowing that the knowledge she'd once used for vengeance now served a greater purpose. The skills that had once destroyed 13 lives now enriched hundreds more. The dining room where masters had ignored the humanity of their servants had become a classroom where former slaves learned to claim their place as full citizens. The kitchen where poison had been prepared now housed a library where children discovered that words could be more powerful than any weapon. But even today, locals in rural Georgia whisper about the old woman who knew every plant in the forest and could cure any ailment or cause any illness depending on what justice required. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.